Today, Minnesotans are debating the future of the civil institution of marriage. People are working vigorously and spending millions here and around the country to redefine the one institution of marriage that applies to all of us. Those of us who believe that that would not be wise policy sought to have a constitutional amendment placed on the ballot this November so that the voters of Minnesota could have their say about the definition of marriage before the judges and politicians of Minnesota had theirs. Since then, the Minnesota Catholic Conference has worked through education and outreach to help Minnesotans and Catholics understand what marriage is, why it's important, and what the consequences will be if it's redefined. Today, we have gathered a series of speakers who can shed light on that issue, particularly that last issue, that is the consequences individuals and society face when marriage is redefined. Beginning in 2003, a series of court cases in most of the Canadian provinces began striking down laws that define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. This culminated in the 2005 Civil Marriage Act of the Canadian Parliament, which made so-called genderless marriage the law of the land. Since then, Canadians who continue to believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and who refuse to recognize this new genderless conception of marriage, have lost their jobs, have been dragged in front of human rights commissions for hate speech, have lost their parental rights, and have been forced to implement so-called diversity curricula in their schools and homes aimed at eradicating such things as, quote, heteronormativity bias, as well as being coerced to accept same-sex marriage. Today we have some people with us who can shed more light on how redefining marriage has impacted Canadian society, particularly in the areas of religious freedom, education, and conscience rights. And make no mistake, we are debating whether marriage should be redefined in Minnesota. Depending on the outcome of this upcoming election, and if the marriage amendment were to fail, marriage could be redefined in Minnesota as early as next year.
In 2005, Canada became the sixth country to legalize some form of same-sex marriage, after Denmark, 1989, same-sex relationships, the Netherlands, 2001, Belgium, 2003, New Zealand, 2004, civil unions, and Spain, 2005. When social change takes place, often it follows the following narrative sequence: tolerate, condone, normalize, promote, and enforce. Part of the normalization involves the appropriation of the vocabulary. Promotion employs information and entertainment media as well as education, often usurping parental rights. Enforcement includes coercion, such as loss of employment or public embarrassment, lawsuits, and state intervention through legislation and funding. These increasingly compromise freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Canada had about 16,500 same-sex marriages in 2011, or 25% of same-sex couples, which was only an increase of about 1,800 per year net of the divorces since the full-year same-sex marriage was legalized federally in 2006. However, the moral and legal repercussions of this phenomenon are disproportionate to these numbers. Fortunately, the Civil Marriage Act explicitly provides for the freedom of religion for churches and religious groups. The Act recognizes that officials of religious groups are free to refuse to perform marriages that are not in accordance with the religious views of the respective faiths. Despite this concession, however, there is a definite chill among those who have legitimate reasons to oppose some rights for homosexuals. Other provinces followed, and in 1977, the Canadian Human Rights Commission was launched. The quasi-judicial bodies dispense with much of the due process we would expect in court, but their decisions are nonetheless binding. And here are a few examples year by year. In 1999, the Ontario Human Rights Commission fined Christian printer Scott Brocky $5,000 for refusing work for the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. By 2004, after appeals, his legal fees had grown to $40,000. In 2001, the Prince Edward Island Human Rights Commission forced the Christian couple Dagmar and Arnos Sapika to close their bed and breakfast and pay $1,000 in damages for refusing to allow practicing homosexuals to take rooms in their home. To stay open, they would have had to submit to a pro-homosexuality seminar by the Human Rights Commission. In 2002, the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal awarded a transsexual woman, previously a man, $7,500 for injury to her dignity and ordered a Vancouver rape crisis center to allow transsexual females to counsel women who are victims of rape. In 2005, the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal demanded that the Knights of Columbus pay $1,000 in damages to a lesbian couple for refusing to rent them a hall for their same-sex wedding. The tribunal said the Knights, however, had the right as a religious group to refuse the facility to the women, but that the women should be compensated for the undue hardship that canceling the event had. The Knights contend that they did, in fact, find another hall for the women. But the story doesn't end there. The Knight responsible for the hall rental worked at a retailer whose warehouse manager was a gay associate of the lesbian couple. The Knight claimed that he was constantly provoked by this manager about the hall rental, and he was eventually fired without cause. In 2005, the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal processed 2 complaints against Calgary Bishop Frederick Henry over the church's teaching on homosexuality that he expressed in a pastoral letter. Fortunately, he had the resources and the public profile to mount an effective defense. Bishop Henry has made several comments on the experience, and I quote, "Human rights laws designed as a shield are now being used as a sword." The issue is rarely true discrimination, but rather censorship and enshrinement of a particular ideology through threats, sanctions, and punitive measures. Only a few human rights tribunal cases are covered by the media. Hearings are held in camera, and many decisions include gag orders, so we never hear about them. Canadian journalist Ezra Levant estimates that 90% of the Human Rights Commission's victims succumb and accept a plea bargain without ever a hearing, and 98% of the rest who are convicted lack the funds to appeal. In 2008, all students in Quebec, whether in public school, private school, or even homeschooled, were mandated to take a program of ethics and religious culture that runs from grade 1 until the end of high school. It requires children to question their own religious upbringing. Last year, Saskatchewan's government announced that its marriage commissioners can be fired for refusing to marry same-sex couples, regardless of their religious convictions.
I want to address, could it happen here? And I want to tell you, it is happening here. But there is a restraint that we have, but I don't know how long it's going to keep. And this is the difference. We have not had all of our First Amendment doctrines developed, our freedom of speech doctrines, in a cultural context where rights for people who engage in same-sex behavior or same-sex marriage, those weren't even issues when we developed our doctrines. So I think to some degree, some of the harsh things that are happening would take longer to take effect here because basically in Canada they've been writing on a blank slate. But I am not sure how long those protections will hold because of some of the cases that we've been dealing with. When I hear the rhetoric of the other side, they always say no one is going to arrest a pastor or punish a pastor for refusing to conduct a same-sex wedding ceremony. And I will just say that has not ever been a major complaint. I mean, I can't even think of anybody who's ever said, I'm really concerned about that happening. The threats are the types of things that we were hearing about in Canada. And so this whole red herring about the pastors being arrested, I just think is not what the real concern is. The kinds of concerns are the hate speech codes, the revoking of licenses for professionals, the punishment of businesses who don't want to deal with same-sex ceremonies, etc. Those are the real problems. The voters of Minnesota have an opportunity to put up a bulwark to prevent this kind of attack on our civil liberties that has happened in Canada, in the United States, and European countries.
Sweden has been recognizing same-sex unions in one form or another for almost 2 decades. Developments in other countries shed further light on the logical direction of what happens when marriage is redefined, namely the elimination of all supposedly discriminatory acts and speech.
There are consequences to children who are growing up in same-sex marriages.
I en miljö där antingen far eller mor saknas.
In an environment where either mother or father is missing.
Det är det som är den stora faran med samkönade äktenskap i vårt land, som jag ser det.
That's the great danger in our country, in the way I see it.
Hur är det möjligt att Sverige som ett kristet land
How can Sweden, as a supposedly Christian country,
kan ställa en pastor inför rätta,
can charge a pastor,
åtala en pastor för att predika Guds ord?
charge him for preaching nothing but the word of God?
Helt plötsligt var jag kriminell eftersom jag hade talat Guds ord.
Suddenly I was considered criminal for preaching the word of God.
Vad berodde det här på?
Why was that?
På ett smart sätt så har undervisningen i kristen tro, etik och moral
In a way, teaching about Christian morality
gradvis tagits bort ifrån skolor och det offentliga livet.
gradually been removed from school teaching and the official society.
Den processen har också påverkat kyrkorna i negativ riktning.
And that process also impacted the churches in a negative way.
Istället för att ta aktiv del i debatten mot denna avkristning
Instead of actively speaking up against this secularization,
valde kyrkoledarna att tiga.
the leaders of many churches opted to just be silent. In 2003, there was an addition to the Swedish law.
Som förbjuder agitation emot minoritetsgrupper.
The law was the law at the time, of course, prohibited incitement of any group of people.
Då kom man också att inkludera homogruppen som en minoritetsgrupp.
And then they not only included homosexuality as one group of people.
Det var mot den lagen som man ansåg att jag hade brutit.
They also added a law that forbid to disrespect or offend that group of people. And they considered my sermon violated that by offending that group of people.
Och då dömdes jag i tingsrätten till 1 månads fängelse.
And in lower court, I was sentenced to 1 month in prison. The argument in our appeal was
Att Europakonventionen för mänskliga rättigheter
that your European Commission for Human Rights,
ger mig yttrande- och religionsfrihet.
that European Commission gives me the right to freedom of speech and religion.
Och att domen mot mig inskränkte på dessa mina rättigheter.
And the verdict against me was in violation of the European Court.
Hovrätten kunde därför inte fälla mig utan jag blev frikänd.
Therefore, the appellate court acquitted me.
Åklagaren var inte nöjd med domen.
The accuser was not happy with the verdict,
Vände sig till högsta domstolen i
turned to
Sverige
the Supreme Court in Sweden
och ville öka mitt straff till 6 månaders fängelse.
and wanted to increase my punishment to 6 months in prison.
Högsta domstolen tar upp mitt fall
The Supreme Court takes my case
och kom fram till att jag skulle kunna dömas efter svensk lag.
and adjudicated and ruled that according to the new Swedish law prohibiting speech, prohibiting offending and disrespecting homosexual, according to that law, I should be sentenced.
Men högsta domstolen ville inte att Sverige skulle få anmärkningar från EU-domstolen.
But the Supreme Court was concerned that Sweden would get a black eye and lose in the European Court on Human Rights.
Så därför så friade man mig.
So because of that, and in order to avoid that embarrassment, I was ultimately acquitted.
Europa.
And my case is now well known in all courts all over Europe.
Min förhoppning är ju att det jag gått igenom
My hope is that what I went through
ska få tjäna som en varning
will be like a warning
till kyrkoledare
to leaders of churches and congregations
i alla västdemokratiska länder
in all democracies in the Western world,
there would be major conflicts. There would be conflicts about whether the school would be teaching kids to disbelieve what their parents and their churches and their religious communities are telling them. But it would also be an issue for religious institutions themselves, because many religious schools say, here's our set of beliefs, here's our creed, here's our catechism. We want to teach about that in accordance with our beliefs, in accordance with our conscience as an organization. It really does divide up into two things. One is curriculum control by the state with respect to private schools. So do private schools get to control what they're going to say? Will they lose their tax exemption, things like that? The other issue is parents and families that are sending their kids to the state schools in Canada, and they have no right to be informed. They don't necessarily have any right to be informed about objectionable material. Do you even get to know when your kids are being taught to believe that your beliefs are wrong? Do you even get the right to be informed? I think that we can learn a lot from that in terms of how it's going to affect the United States. There's going to see the same sorts of things going on in the U.S. where same-sex marriage is recognized as co-equal to man-woman marriage. So the leading case here is the Parker against Hurley case from 2008, First Circuit case. It involved parents who objected to having their kids taught from the book King and King. The parents asked merely to be informed and the chance to take their kids out from that particular bit of the teaching. They weren't asking to tell everybody else that they can't hear about the story. They were asking just with respect to their kids. They didn't get either of those things from the court. And the First Circuit in Boston said, they could not take their kids out, and they had no right to be told in advance or even afterwards what their kids have been taught. So that's already happening, and part of the ground for that was the fact that same-sex marriage had already been recognized as under the laws in Massachusetts. So what will happen is schools, Catholic schools, Orthodox Jewish schools, other religious schools that have an objection will actually come under pressure from accrediting agencies to change their curriculum. And you can already see this happening at the higher education level. There's been a couple of different cases about this. Doug Laycock, who's a professor at the University of Virginia Law School and a supporter of same-sex marriage, by the way, he says that there's a real problem with the fact that the stakes have been raised so high and that it has become a completely ideological struggle. It's bad for the country and it's bad for the polity to have that. So I think that we're going to find out in the context of that fight whether our laws, our federal civil rights laws, and our Constitution are strong enough to protect religious liberty.
What the federal government did was set the tone. And essentially what they've done is they've said, we're going to legalize same-sex marriage through the Civil Marriage Act, which eventually passed. But we've got some people here who don't agree, and do they need protection? Should we protect them? It essentially cast out everybody who was opposed to same-sex marriage. And that's really the big problem with, the legal problem rather, with same-sex marriage. It's completely changed the way human rights law works. It's completely revamped the way we treat equality rates in Canada. You can be equal and you can be treated in an equal manner, but you can be treated in a different manner. And the prime example of that is sex. Men and women are equal, but we're treated differently. When I go to the airport and they pat me down, they give me a man to pat me down. And if I demanded, if they had given me a woman to pat me down, well, that would be a violation of my human rights. So I'm equal to a woman and a woman is equal to me, but we are treated differently. And effectively what's happened is we have a minority which is dictating the norms for the majority. So of course, with the redefinition of marriage, we did change the way marriage looks in Canada. In my opinion, it was unnecessary because in 1999, our Supreme Court had ruled that same-sex couples could benefit from the same protections and so on as common law spouses. So in Canada, you can be married or you can have a common law relationship. And a lot of the rights are very similar. So in 1999, our Supreme Court says same-sex couples living together in a conjugal relationship, you will benefit from the common law protection, which means that if I have a health plan, my same-sex common law spouse can sign on to it and so on. But with the actual redefinition of marriage, what we've done is we've taken the focus off from marriage off of the child and focused it on adults. So before 2005, before same-sex marriage came about in Canada, the focus of marriage really was around the child. Marriage was a child-centered institution. Now, of course, there are couples that don't have children, but that's the exception, not the rule. Next, we did redefine the family. Of course, with the redefinition of marriage, children went from having one mother and one father to having two mothers or two fathers. And in 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal said, you know what, you can have two mothers and a father. In a case known as AA versus BB, because we go by initials on private matters, the Court of Appeal of Ontario dealt with a case where a lesbian couple conceived using the sperm of a friend, a male friend, of course. And after that happened, all three, both mothers, I'm going to use that, and the biological father went to court and said, of course, this child has a biological mother, has a biological father, but what about the other woman in the picture? We want her to be a mother as well. And the Court of Appeal said, yeah, of course, two mothers, one father. Now, of course, you know, that right now we're limited to three, but who knows how much more we'll go, how much further we'll go. Now, what's concerning about that decision is the court didn't have the legislative authority to make that decision. The governing legislation did not permit for redefining the family. But what the court concluded was that under the doctrine of parens patriae, which is the court is the parent of the land, they had the authority and the obligation to go ahead and redefine family in the way they did because of what they termed to be a legislative gap. So again, we've got an unelected judiciary making decisions which affect not only law but family. And that's really what's important to take out of this entire day. Is we've heard discussions of unintended consequences, we've heard discussions of sociological impacts, philosophical impacts. There were very far-reaching consequences as a result of the redefinition of marriage, which I don't think were thought out. Somebody mentioned, you know, it'll just be live and let live. Well, it's not. There's a case going on right now. The trial is at the end of the month, and it involves a guy I went to school with, a guy who was in my elementary school. And what happened here was he is a gay man, and there is a lesbian couple, and they worked out a contract between themselves. He would provide the sperm to one of the women to be impregnated. She would keep the baby for her and her wife, and they would repeat the process afterwards where he would get the baby. So eventually they each end up with one kid. So we're brokering families now. Well, after the first pregnancy, she decided, you know what, I don't want to do this again. And so now he's sued for custody and access. And the trial in that case will be at the end of the month. And we don't know what's going to happen. But this summer, there was a motion for interim access. And the decision from the court in that motion was it would not be in the best interest of the child to have the biological father be involved and in contact with the child, because we don't know what's going to happen at the trial in October. Well, of course, that case is going to be appealed regardless of the outcome. It's going to go to the Court of Appeal, and it'll subsequently likely go to the Supreme Court. So this man who wants to see his biological son will likely have to wait 3, 4, or 5 years, if at all. You've heard of the marriage commissioner, so I won't speak about it very long, but there were a series of cases before human rights tribunals dealing with marriage commissioners who refused to officiate same-sex marriages. And ultimately, this resulted in a reference before the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal on whether or not they could protect the marriage commissioners. And ultimately, the decision of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal was no, if you're a marriage commissioner, if you're a civil servant, you have to perform these same-sex marriages, despite your religious beliefs.
I devoted most of my working career to public education. As a teacher, a university instructor, and Ontario Ministry of Education consultant, I saw the changes beginning to take place. It is critical that the people of Minnesota understand that if same-sex marriage is legalized, the new law will require the public schools to change the curriculum to align with this new definition of marriage and the related sexual alternative content. An examination of the new lessons and the education environment suggests that it has become a system that favors the most liberal values and undermines the constitutional rights of families whose children are being raised in traditional cultures and faiths. Most of us have to understand, when we talk about equity, sometimes we think it's a synonym for equality, but it's not. Equity means systems may implement strategies and policies to address marginalized groups, even if those strategies constitutionally negatively affect other groups. In the recent legislation, the strategies were outlined. First of all, schools must implement gay-straight alliance clubs. Clubs that affirm sexual alternative lifestyles and same-sex marriage. Second, we're going to have sexual lifestyle instruction integrated so that it permeates the curriculum, all subject areas from kindergarten to grade 12. Thirdly, rental agreements. I don't know what it's like here in Minnesota, but we have thousands of churches in the province of Ontario who rent school facilities for their services. They are told that if you are going to rent our facilities, you have to put your doctrine on the back burner and follow the Ontario Provincial Code of Conduct, which are the guidelines for operating public schools. Let's first look at the student clubs. The legislation says, every board shall support activities or organizations that promote the awareness and understanding of and respect for people of all sexual orientations and genders, including organizations named gay-straight alliances. We have to put these in place. There is no choice. In Ontario, GSA clubs are being given special privileges to host assemblies in schools for all of the students. They are the directors of the anti-bullying campaigns in the schools. And in Dundas Parkside High School, a GSA assembly, Laura Wolfson, was one of the speakers. Well, Laura is a mentor from to that GSA club. She is a lesbian who was introduced as an expert in Old Testament scripture. Laura presented a very similar message to Dan Savage's, but the students were not allowed to leave. In, for example, community units, primary students will learn about alternative families, same-sex families. They're going to read books about same-sex families, okay? In music class, I talked to a teacher. He said, Phil, I was just given a book by my principal of songs about going to gay pride, about my same-sex parents, I have to teach these songs to the students in grades 1, 2, and 3, and I have no choice. In drama class, students will have assignments portraying same-sex and LGBT situations. This reminds me of a situation last February when a parent called and said, Phil, what am I going to do? My 8-year-old in grade 3 just came home and said, Mom, I just married my best friend Jim. She said, what happened? Well, today we talked about different kinds of families. We talked about same-sex marriage. And a minister came in and said this was okay. And we were told, hey, choose somebody in your class, a friend that you'd like to marry, a same-sex friend. And they had a mock wedding ceremony, and they celebrated with cake and ice cream afterwards. Math class. How do you integrate this into math? Math problems will include alternative family situations. But I spoke with a textbook publisher, and he said, Phil, I have to have a disproportionate representation of alternative sexual lifestyles in my curriculum. I said, in my textbooks, or my textbook will not be approved for Circular 14. That's the official list of textbooks that can be used in schools. I said, what's this going to look like in math? He said, well, I'll give you an example. Are you familiar with Pythagorean's theorem? You know, the square on the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares on the other two sides. The practical application of that is a carpenter trying to calculate the length of a rafter. In our textbook, the carpenter must be is a cross-dressing carpenter. Textbooks also, we have to implement a queer hero strategy. Those that have been successful and who are homosexual, their sexual orientation must be represented in the textbook. So in Canada, Roberta Barnardar is a successful scientist, but no, first in the textbook says she is a successful lesbian Canadian scientist.
Almost immediately after same-sex marriage was legalized in Canada, I began to learn about changes that were planned for the public school curriculum in my province. What I learned deeply troubled me. School officials embarked almost immediately on a program that they themselves refer to as the unlearning process. Materials relating to same-sex marriage were to permeate all subjects and all grade levels. In my jurisdiction, a school can only purchase textbooks from an approved list. A book will not get onto the approved list unless it somehow incorporates materials relating to same-sex marriage. It's not difficult to distinguish between the pretense and the true cause in this situation. The real goal is not to use same-sex marriage as an aid in teaching the 3 R's to young children. Quite the opposite, actually. Instead, the objective becomes using the 3 R's as an aid to teach acceptance of same-sex marriage to young children who are lacking in both spiritual maturity and critical thinking skills. My local school board actually has a policy which requires them to accommodate the constitutionally protected right to freedom of religious expression. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses are permitted to opt out of classes where materials dealing with Halloween, Christmas, or Easter are referred to even indirectly. The religious accommodations granted to students of the Islamic faith are even more generous. Muslim girls who wear the burqa are exempt from gym class. Similarly, Muslim students can choose to opt out of music classes. One final example involves a high school in Toronto. On Friday afternoon, the cafeteria is converted into a mosque for prayers. I don't necessarily begrudge these groups their religious accommodations. I only mention them to illustrate just how reasonable my own request for accommodation was. But what exactly did I ask the board? I asked for 2 simple things. Firstly, I asked that I be given advance notice of when my children would be exposed to materials which could conflict with my family's sincerely held Christian beliefs. Secondly, I asked that my children be allowed to abstain from lessons or activities during which these materials would be presented. It is important to note that I requested accommodation not merely because indoctrination might offend my children's spiritual sensitivities. In my faith, indoctrination is considered to be a form of false teaching. Abstaining from false teachings is an absolute requirement of my Christian faith. This religious practice, since it is an absolute requirement, is for the purpose of religious accommodation analogous to Muslims abstaining from gym class or music. In making my request for religious accommodation, I did not hesitate to share aspects of my faith with the board. I advised them that all people, including members of the gay community, were created in the image of God. I told them that my faith teaches us not to condemn other people, and to do so is considered a sin. In my faith, we were to love other people, including ones we disagree with. I even shared with them that, in a way, Jesus was an anti-bullying superhero, since he once saved the life of someone who was being stoned for her lifestyle. Unfortunately, holding these benign beliefs did not prevent me from being considered a homophobe. My request for religious accommodation was denied. All I was trying to do was protect my children from indoctrination. My religious beliefs seemed so benign and non-threatening, especially compared to some of the beliefs that were already being accommodated. In my mind, my legal challenge is fundamentally about discrimination. I am only asking for what is freely being given to members of other faiths. In Canada, the redefinition of marriage has been associated with a complete loss of parental rights in the school system. Indeed, the training document given to teachers to aid in the implementation of the new curriculum denies the very existence of parental rights. Prior to the legalization of same-sex marriage, keeping parents abreast of what was being taught was the standard of practice in the teaching profession. In Ontario, students have a journal that they bring home every day called the Daily Agenda. This journal is supposed to be used, if need be, on a daily basis to communicate concerns to parents. Teachers are supposed to have lesson plans written ahead of time. There's absolutely no reason why I cannot be given advance notice of when this material is going to be presented. If my child was not good at math and I wanted to know when they were going to be teaching algebra so that I could get a tutor for my kid, a teacher would never refuse to tell me when they were going to teach a subject. In fact, a teacher that refuses would be fired. However, when I want to know when my children will be learning about same-sex marriage, it's none of my business. Do the people of Minnesota want to live in a state where you have to go to court to find out what your children are learning? This is not hyperbole. This incursion on parental rights is typical in jurisdictions where marriage is redefined. There has already been a case very similar to this in Massachusetts. It's not a coincidence that Massachusetts was the first state to recognize same-sex marriage. This child is not being denied any opportunity whatsoever. In a scenario that satisfies my opt-out criteria, the child who stays behind gets to have their family structure affirmed by an employee of the state in the absence of competing worldviews. This child appears to be a beneficiary, not a victim. If your beliefs don't offend someone, you probably don't believe in anything at all. Free expression is protected in our constitutions precisely because beliefs are frequently offensive to others. This constitutional reality is very inconvenient to those who want to prevent opt-outs. The pathologies of Christian indifference and apathy are perhaps bigger threats than the radical secular humanists that surround you. Your citizenship in a country with so much freedom is a gift from God. There are responsibilities associated with this liberty. Would God place you in a free country with the expectations that you would do nothing when the well-being of your children is threatened? If you have the ability to resist and choose not to, I fear that the warning in Matthew 18:6 will apply to you as well. I pray that you are successful in protecting traditional marriage. Please pray for my family. Thank you.